Well, good day to you. It is August the 6th, and I hope wherever you are doing really well. My name is Gary Willing. I want to welcome everyone to Search for Signs if you're new, and thank you and welcome you back if you have been here before. But if you are anything like me, when I first heard this information, in fact, I didn't hear it, I actually read it in a book back in like 93. So it's almost been 30 years, I think, since I read something for the first time about Maitreya. I didn't agree with this information at all. In fact, I would say the majority of what I had read I didn't like or agree with. But I at least was open enough to try to read a little bit more about it, and then I put it aside. I perhaps internalized a little bit about what I read, didn't like this, didn't like that, liked this, didn't, that kind of thing. And over time, I kind of started to see that there was some truth to this, but it took me investigating for myself. Unfortunately, when I first read about this information, there wasn't anything called the internet where you could just sit down and get whatever you want, whenever you want, how fast ever you want it, right? It took time. But you don't have to take as much time as I did to really see if there's any truth to it. Really, it just takes you just investigating by going to a few websites. And I've included the websites in the description portion of these videos, all the links that you would need to really look and see if there's any information that you might agree with or not, see if there's any truth to this information for yourself or not in that way. And that's why I put them in there for you. I have no fear about you coming to the end of your road of the investigation and saying, I don't agree with anything about this, but at least you took the time to do it. So I encourage everyone to read more about this. Check out some of the websites that I provided links for in the description portion of these videos. They're there for you whenever you want to look into it, and they're all free. If you want to join the discussion, of course, you can tell me what you think by posting a comment. Preferably, I would rather you ask a question because then I can come up with something to say in the next video. So you can post your questions in the comment section, or you can email me at searchforsigns@mail.com. But I did have a question that came my way from Jerry Wells. And I have to say, this is an extraordinary question. It's a question that I wish, Jerry, you had been around when Ben was alive and thought to ask him this question, because I would have loved to have heard his answer, to be honest. But your question was the Masters or Maitreya working with George C. Marshall during the planning stages of the Marshall Plan? If so, was he aware of this? Quite an extraordinary question, wonderful question. Like I said, I wish you would have asked Ben that question, because he would have known and he would have been able to give you a really good answer. Because he's passed away, perhaps you'll have to wait till Maitreya's out and known for who he is, and you can ask him that question. Yo, Maitreya, I got a question for you, and then ask him this question if you are brave enough to ask a master a question, I guess. But anyway, I think it's wonderful. But unfortunately, I don't have the answer for that. I can only guess, just like you can guess. But I would say, based upon the point in evolution of who and what George C. Marshall, where he was in his point in evolution, that the answer to that question would probably be no, that the Masters did not work with him directly in that way. But hear me out. His point in evolution, he was halfway between the first and the second initiation, about on par or with the average world leader, really. And that's it. So from our perspective, pretty advanced members of humanity, but from the Master's point of view, just babies, really. I mean, infants in the Christ principle in that way. It's not until somebody reaches the level of a Martin Luther King or Gandhi or Picasso or or John F. Kennedy, to where the Masters would call them a baby in the Christ. In fact, actually, in one of the books of the Bible, it said, out of the mouths of babes shall speak the truth. It never says at the end times, but a lot of very paranoid religious people throw that in there. They say in the end times, out of the mouths of babes. It doesn't say that. It's just out of the mouths of babes. And what they were talking about were babes in Christ, someone who has taken the first and the second initiation. So George C. Marshall had just taken one. Like I said, very advanced from our point of view, but from the Master's point of view, just an infant. Now, I don't think that George C. Marshall stayed up one night and developed the Marshall Plan on his own. I think he had a group of people working with him. And this is where I do think there were disciples within that group who were very advanced, working consciously with one of the masters. But in order for someone to be working consciously with a master in that way, you'd have to be on par with somebody like Abraham Lincoln or Ben or Mozart or Rembrandt. I mean, very advanced disciple in order to be able to receive messages telepathically in that way from a master, for them to work in that way. But I do think that George C. Marshall probably had a group of people that were working, trying to develop a plan for Europe right after World War II to help rebuild it. And within that group were people who were very advanced, working with the disciples, and they had the knowledge, the wisdom to be able to see what they were doing and why it was so important for humanity that we do the Marshall Plan, and the will to get it done. And it would not have been, because it was such an important plan to be put into place, and I'm going to talk about why it was so important. But it was really the future of humanity hinged upon the fact of whether we could do it or not. That it would not have been left to somebody like George C. Marshall to be able to do it. Had George C. Marshall's point in evolution been up there on par with an Abraham Lincoln, then I would say, yeah, he was probably working consciously with one of these masters. But, you know, when Ben's master verified that his point evolution was somewhere between the first and the second, I would say he was probably one of the groups around him. But was he mentally impressed by one of these masters in order to start it? Probably so. That's the most common way that these masters get an idea out to a disciple. They don't work telepathically moment to moment like they did with somebody like Benjamin Creme. They impress upon the mind of the disciple about an idea, whether it's an invention, a discovery, a political idea, economic idea, whatever. And it usually comes during the sleep state. In fact, actually, there's an article that I read from Benjamin Creme's master entitled Continuity of Consciousness. I just recorded it, I think, just over the past few weeks, so you don't have to dig that far back to listen to it. And he talks about that's how the normal way that the masters get their ideas out to disciples is they impress upon their mind in a sleep state. The problem is that most of us don't remember what we experience in our sleep state, except for just a few dreams here or there, but we're not really conscious of being instructed by a master. But that's what happens to disciples when they are sleeping, is they're instructed by these masters in that way. Given an idea, they're impressed upon a part of the plan that they might need to do and that kind of thing. And the problem is, too, is that it takes a while for it to kind of filter down into the mind of the disciple, where they'll do anything with it. And then oftentimes it just depends on the person. They might thwart the idea to where the original intention of the master it's not even remotely the same. You know, they could use it selfishly for themselves, where it should have been given freely to humanity in that way, and because it wasn't even their idea. But it just depends on what's going on. But that's the problem with it. And it takes somebody who has to be, they're very, very advanced to be able to they have to actually get up on what's called the Buddhic plane in order to be able to receive a message from a master clearly in that way, like somebody like Benjamin Creme could do. So that's why I would say probably it was one of his group of advisors, whether it was one or two or three of them were very advanced. Like I said, had the ability to be able to come up with it, the wisdom to see the importance of it, and the will to be able to get it done. You'd have to have all three of those things to be able to do it, because it's not looked upon in this way now, but eventually it would be looked upon as a huge step back from the abyss that humanity took. It allowed Maitreya to be able to enter the everyday world again after eons upon eons upon eons of the masters living apart from humanity. Because when Maitreya made the announcement in June of 1945 that he was going to have to come back, there was a reason why he said that he would have to come back far sooner than the masters had ever expected. One was because the Axis powers were defeated, and the Axis powers were supported and influenced by the forces of darkness. So by their defeat, because of the allies who were supported and influenced by the forces of light, the power and the influence of the forces of darkness over humanity had diminished. So it allowed them to be able to come back, kind of turn the tide on that stalemate that had been going on for eons. And it kind of gave an advantage to the forces of light. And so the masters wanted to take advantage of it and be able to come back where they didn't think they would be able to come back at that time. The other thing, too, which is probably more crucial to the survival of humanity than even that, is the masters clearly started to see a clear future where humanity would destroy itself nuclearly, because we had just invented the nuclear bomb. And if they did not come back, along, Maitreya and these group of masters, we would eventually destroy ourselves. So those are the two reasons why they came back. But there were three things that humanity had to do to indicate to Maitreya that we were ready for change. We were ready for peace. One, he said, a measure of peace had to have been established. The principle of sharing had to start to at least govern the minds of the world leaders at the time, which is where the Marshall Plan fits into those two things. And then the third thing, which I do think it takes the eyes of the Lord of Love, being able to see things in the way that he see things, to be able to see this in humanity. But the political parties around the world, in the United States and in other countries, had to start to clean up some of their corruption. I don't see that, but he saw enough of it to where it made sense to him to come back. But the Marshall Plan, according to the masters, was the only time that humanity tried the principle of sharing, just tried it. And the results were nothing short of miraculous. Now, was it his intention to start the principle of sharing? I don't think so. I also don't think that George C. Marshall's plan was what historians think, where his only intention was to stop the communist insurgency in Europe. I think he was an extraordinary man in his own right, perhaps a bit more of a humanitarian than a military guy, even though he was a general. And, was open enough to suggestion to try this plan, which was the principle of sharing. Now, why is it miraculous? Because it did exactly what Maitreya said the principle of sharing would do. It brought about justice amongst these nations, and it brought a measure of peace. He says, without sharing, there will be no justice. Without justice, there will be no peace. And without peace, there will be no future. And it did just that. It's extraordinarily hopeful for humanity that we tried it. It's also extraordinarily sad that we haven't done anything with it. In fact, historians, professors, our political and economic world leaders do not look at the Marshall Plan as an option to do today. We have evidence that sharing does bring about peace. We have it right there in front of our face, but yet nobody looks at it like this. In fact, if you go to the link in the description of, I always talk about the links of that talk about this information in some way. One of those links is a link to the YouTube page for the History Channel, where they talk about the Marshall Plan, but they don't talk about it bringing about peace. But yet that's exactly what it did. The Marshall Plan, the reason why it was the principle of sharing, because the United States gave excesses of what they had just sitting there to Western Europe to rebuild Europe. And then once it didn't stop there, and then once the nations that took those excesses started to rebuild their economies and their infrastructures and that kind of thing, they were able to give excesses back in payment to the United States after taking something. That's the principle of sharing. That's how it looks. So it was the principle of sharing, even though it was done just for a brief amount of time. But why it was miraculous was it created goodwill amongst those nations. It created a measure of peace in a continent that historically, over the centuries, was not known for being a peaceful continent. So, it did everything that Maitreya needed us to do in order to signal to him that humanity was ready for change, was ready for peace, was ready to accept the principle of sharing. It did everything. And in the future, after the masters, I think it will take the masters coming out and the principle of sharing starting for people to see what we did in the 40s, with the Marshall Plan and how important it was. But we will see that that was a huge step back from the abyss. It's not the only step that we have to take, but it was a huge step back. You know what I'm saying? It was also we'll probably be racking our heads in the future, why did we not continue on with this? Why did we not try this with the Middle East? Why did we not try this with North Korea and that kind of thing, with China and those kind of things, to bring about goodwill amongst those nations where, nations that hate each other today, if we had just tried the principle of sharing globally and never ended, the Vietnam War would have never existed. The Korean War would have never happened. The Iraqi, Desert Storm would have never happened. We would have never had 9/11. Those things would have never happened in our history. But because it stopped and we didn't try it with those nations, we don't have a peaceful relationship with those nations. But the nations that we did participate and work together in the Marshall Plan, we trust them better than we do other nations. We have a goodwill relationship with them. It's the only way to bring about peace, according to the masters. Huge, huge, huge event that most people don't even think about. Our world leaders don't look as a possibility to do. They don't even look at it. They don't even think to look at it. But anyway, I really appreciate the question. I wish Ben could have answered it and not me, but I love you guys. Thank you so much. You have a great rest of your weekend, and I look forward to talking to you again in future videos. Have a great day. Remember to take action and help SOP save our planet. Thanks for listening, and we look forward to talking to you again in future videos.